but I want to talk about staff. I was so concerned about this area that Bishop and I met with that issue for over an hour. We talked it through. And what I want to do is give you an outline of what the large church staff looks like and what the transitions need to be to move this church from its medium size, 400, to its larger size of 800. And the first issue is we look about the role and function of staff. The traditional staff model is what we call a doing model. There is one staff person who supervises 10 different kinds of things they do. And each of those has 10 or 15 people in that ministry. And so, Bishop knows this, the old staffing ratio that was used in churches is just give one person a staff job for every 150 people you got and you're good to go. Well, the problem is that formula is what stops churches around 400. Okay, that's where it stops it. So there is another option, and that is the large church model says that every staff person you have, they develop 5 leaders who each look after 7 to 10 ministries, which minister to 10 or 15 people. And so you have the capacity then as a leader to include and minister to, through others, 300 to 500 people. And it's interesting for me to observe that quite often smaller churches have more paid staff than larger churches do. Do you know why? Because larger churches change the staff. Now listen to this, listen carefully. The difference between a church of 400 and 800, the staff of a church of 400 does ministry. The staff of a church of 800 develops leaders for ministry. Now, I was talking to Simeon. Simeon is a great staff person in this church. I've had an opportunity to meet him. Boy, I'll tell you, he's busy. I mean, he works his fingers to the bone. Now, I just asked him a simple question. What would happen if we added another 400 people into the church? What would happen to you? He'd be burned out and done in 6 months. So what's going to happen? He can't take on any more capacity for ministry when all of his work is doing. So he has to change the focus from doing to developing. Now what happens is if he's developing 5 leaders and doesn't have all these ministries and things, he can actually get time for a game of golf with Bishop. But are you understanding that difference? So as we discuss and get through this, watch this. Bishop is going to start reorganizing everything that's done in Shield of Faith. And he's going to do it by placing leaders who develop leaders in every single department. He's not going to have anybody that he says to you, I want you to do all this. He's going to ask the question differently. Here's the ministries, and I want you to develop leaders for it. You want to make that shift. Why? Because as the church grows, the number one key to effectively leading it is the development of that middle management. Now you see in many African American churches, the big issue that causes churches of this size to be afraid of that is trust. So we want to control everything. But you see, the problem is what we want to do with people is we want to supervise people instead of develop people. If I work with Bernetta, if I work with Bishop, and he and I have been friends for a lot of years, we talk and he pours into my life. I pour into his life. I come to a church like this, he trusts me for what I would say because he knows my heart. He's not afraid. He's not afraid of things that I say that'll upset the apple cart. Do you know why? We've got relationship. So if you are building ministry and you don't build it off relationship, you don't build trust into the system. And you don't build trust without developing people. You don't develop trust by supervising people, by just telling people what to do. You do it by imparting your heart, letting them feel the spirit that you have and your love for Christ and the lost. Letting people know that God cares about them and you care about them. And you're, for example, even our PhD mentors, when they meet with their students, do you know the first question they ask is, how's your devotional life been going? How's God been speaking to you? Tell me about your relationship with lost people you know. Our mentors ask those questions before they ask a single question about a book they've written or a paper they've written. Because character, this is important, character is more important than competence. We're always looking for people who are competent, but they fail because of character. Think about it. Think of everybody you know in ministry, and I'll guarantee you it will be hard-pressed to find anyone who fails because of their competence. I'll guarantee that every failure you've noticed comes because of their character. So you want the church to grow? The focus changes from doing to developing. It changes from ministry to the many to ministry to the few. The way to impact the ministry to the many is to intensify the ministry to the few. You understand that principle? Okay? So, for example, Bernetta, you guys are getting married. I'm so happy for you. I've been following your stuff on Facebook. It's just an amazing. But you guys are both amazingly called to ministry. And you want to impact thousands, right? Well, find 4 or 5 people that you can pour your life into and you'll have a ministry to thousands. Try and minister to 20 or 30 people and you'll have a ministry to 20, 30 people, but it won't go beyond that. Do you understand the difference? Because there's a big difference between your span of control, your span of care, and your span of influence. Your span of care can be what a small group leader does. He cares for 12 to 15 people. A span of control is what a leader like Simeon does and can care for, supervise a certain number of ministries, maybe 8 or 10. But the span of character development, the span of influence is always down around one handful. The larger it gets, the less influence there is. Okay? So when I was pastoring a staff of a large church, we were averaging worship attendance of around 2,000. Every staff meeting, I asked 2 questions for all staff. Number 1, tell me about the meetings you've had with your leaders in this past week. How are their marriages? How are they doing with their outreach? How are they doing with their spiritual development? Every staff person would answer that question every week. Every week. Then the second question we would always ask is the people that God has strategically and supernaturally placed in our life, how are we doing with our witness? Did you have lunch with anybody who didn't know the Lord? Did you go out for a game of golf with them? Did you do something with somebody who didn't know Jesus this week? And by the way, I let some staff go because they wouldn't do either of those 2 things. Why? Because we couldn't be a church of 2,000 if we had people who were just sitting around on their thumbs, not reaching people who are lost, and not developing leaders that needed the church to grow. And that's an important shift. So when pastor is sitting down with you as leaders and trying to say, if we're going to get ready for what God wants to do, and by the way, the word of the Lord to me is this. This is going to be the most influential church, African American church in this city. That's the word of the Lord to me. But anytime there's a revival, anytime there's a mighty move of God, there's always been preparation before it. Always. Always. So what's happening is the transitional changes may take some time. But trust me on this. If God knows you're making those changes to be faithful to His mission, guess what? The anointing will fall. The anointing will fall. So you need to recognize that the church is organization and organism. You can't solve your administrative problems with spiritual solutions, and you can't solve your spiritual problems by just throwing a program band-aid at it. And so your staff needs to have the ability to work in both areas. I may have staff underneath me, and I've developed their character, and their character's doing very well, but they're having some problems in their ministry area. They're not sure about their budget. They're not sure about some of their program outreaches. They're not sure about that. So I need to be able to help them with the administrative solutions, but I can't neglect the spiritual solutions. Bad leaders only deal with the administrative. Good leaders deal with both. Okay? Does that all make sense to you all? Because you're body and building. So this is the ideal. And I'm going to talk about this for just a moment, and then I want to explain it in terms of where you are. Ideally, if you look at the executive pastor line, you will notice that there's a lot of the administrative function of the church. I mean, you've got to have bulletins printed every week. You've got to have bank deposits made every week. You've got to have checks written every week. You have to have board meetings scheduled. You have to have facility issues. There are lots of administrative issues. The problem is a church can get overloaded in that area. There are other things which are the ministry and missions. That has to do with the outreach programs of the church, the spiritual formation issues. It has to do with the pastoral care. It has to do with the life groups. It has a lot of other areas. Now, what you see here is that the staff, that is the people like Simon, Bernetta, others, who are at this staff level, your job is ministry unit leaders, developing the leaders in all the ministries. That's your job. Now, right now, let me explain this. Where it says the level of executive pastor and executive pastor ministry and missions, that position in your church is not there yet. Right now, all the staff are reporting directly to Bishop Alexander. He's got a tentative plan. It's getting close. It's getting pretty close. Bishop Alexander will tell you that right now it's going to be 8 to 10 wide at that point. I told Bishop, you keep it that wide, you're set for burnout. But I said, I'll coach with you, your leaders, so that we can get these leaders functioning and then group them into the ministry functions and the administrative functions and get your span of control down. Because the higher up in the organization one becomes, the narrower your span of control needs to be. That's what Moses was talking about. Moses, when Jethro said, you can't handle all the details, Moses. Handle the big issues. Let the other leaders handle the little ones. And so here's what happens. It's when you are a leader, you have to be delegated not only authority, but you have to be given responsibility. And so, if you operate within the confines of your budget, and you know that you need to take a leader out to lunch to spend some quality time with them, and that's part of your budget, you don't need to, for a $20 expense, go all the way up the line and get approval of the bishop with that incidental thing like that. Not worth doing. I mean, you're taking more of his time than the lunch is worth. Isn't worth it. But you have to have a freedom to function within what you're doing. But when you're doing it, listen, you have to have goals that are agreed on with bishop. You have what are called a ministry action plan. Now you'll see some dotted lines on the diagram. The dotted lines is we don't operate in silos. So we have to work with the others. So Simon and Andrea and some of the others that are in staff, they not only have to work within their areas of responsibility, they have to learn to work together. Because what you can do together is greater than the sum total of what you do individually. So line relationships are always formed based on the direct authority that is given. And staff relationships are always where there is no direct authority. Okay? So line relationships are necessary for accountability. Staff relationships are necessary because of synergy, because of communication, because of missiological coordination. Everybody working together for the common good. And so, this diagram was put up. I was going to modify it to where we had our discussion with Bishop, but I thought it would be best to give you the large theory and then simply say, this diagram and the diagram that Bishop will present to you to understand the church and the way it functions, your staff are going to shift from doers to developers. Okay, that is the primary premise. So you need to understand that difference between span of control and the span of control for growth. Leaders can get beyond their capacity. For example, why do we say small groups should not exceed 15 people? Because each of us, as individuals, has a relational capacity. That is, I have 12 to 15 people in my life that I count as special. Okay? They're the people that are in my sphere of influence. The Bible called that my oikos. Now, of my group, some of them are unsaved. Because if all your relationships are filled with people who are Christians, you got no room relationally for people who are not. So I have 5 people who in my sphere, my relational capacity, I have 5 people who are non-Christians, 10 who are. Bishop is one of the 10 who are in my Christian influence, my sphere of influence, my sphere of care. So Bishop knows anytime he needs to talk with me, anytime he needs to call me. When we need to just have lunch for fellowship, we do it anytime we need to, right? That's the way it works. Okay? That's the span, that's the relational capacity. Now we're talking not relationally, now we're talking in terms of the ministry, and that moves from the normal care level, the relational level, to the ministry action level, and that span normally has to be no larger than 6 and not much smaller than 3. That's the range that it goes in. And here's the interesting thing, is your span of control can increase very rapidly if you don't recognize line authority. So, for example, I'm going to give you an illustration. Let's say there's a leader underneath Simon's control. And that leader doesn't like what Simon says, doesn't like what Simon, the correction Simon is given to keep the church on track. So that person just bypasses him and comes over to Bishop. They do it. Now, the time they come to Bishop, has increased Bishop's span of control by 1 and reduced your span of control by 1. You know why? Because once you violate it, they never go back under it. So, if they come to you, Bishop, and they report to Simon, you say, talk to Simon about it, and if Simon has a problem, he can talk to me. You know why? It's not that your pastor doesn't care about all the people. It's your pastor cares about the overall mission of the church and wants to ensure that the work gets done. He wants to give the authority to his leaders, but he also wants to keep his leaders communicating clearly with him. He doesn't want to undermine their authority, because after a while, what you've got is a bunch of do-gooders trying to keep him happy, not people who are actually getting the job done. Okay? Now, the key issue in down-the-line relationships is what is called the servant leader. It is not what can people do for me, but what can I do to help people. Does that make sense? Okay? I am responsible for my leaders to help them become everything God has created them capable of being. I want my leaders to be bigger leaders spiritually. And here's the interesting thing. Sometimes you have a leader like that, and you sense, and they sense, God is calling them to something greater. Then you send them on to do something greater. It's blessed. It's blessed. Do you know why? Because if you don't have the relationship and then they decide they want to do something different, you got a split on your hands, not a birth. You can always birth new ministries through relationships. You know that. How do you birth a new child? Through the relationship of a man and a woman. How do you split a relationship? Through divorce. One is healthy, the other is not. Okay? So, here's what you do. Staff. You push problems up, you push praise down. You push problems up, you push praise down. Never, ever, ever. Listen, those of you who report to Bishop, Bernetta, Simon, who else reports directly to Bishop? Put up your hand. Don't you ever speak bad about your bishop. Ever. Why? If there's a problem, push it up to him and talk it through. Figure it out, the solution. You push that problem down, you've undermined all of your ministry, all of his ministry, and you've become a tool of Satan in the church. Are you catching this? When I said I was going to step on some toes, I was going to do it. So, leaders are the lid. That's the principle. Leaders are always the lid. Since the church rises or falls on leadership, it's the way the leadership staff works together towards that common objective that sets the tone for that ministry where Bishop would like to see the church be. You want the law of the lid lifted. You want the capacity lifted. Now, by the way, this is a focus group I did. This is just one of those little bonus items that I put in just for the fun of it. What staff should be able to count on? If you're working and a bishop asks you to be in a staff position, or you're a ministry leader and you ask someone to be in a staff position, I interviewed over 500 of them. Here's what I learned. Loyalty. Don't speak badly of any evil to your staff, to anyone. Biblically, gossip is a sin. So you might as well know that up front. Always speak good about your leaders. Always. Always make sure your leaders have the resources to support the ministry they're doing. Always make sure they have it. If it's space to meet, if it's time on the schedule, if it's financial resources, if it's training they need, make sure they're resourced. Third, make sure you give people freedom to be creative. Believe it or not all the good ideas are mine or yours. And in a marriage, by the way, that's a great marriage tip, free of charge. As a husband and wife, what you do is you find out that marriages go bad when the wife thinks she knows everything or the husband thinks he knows everything. That all the good ideas are mine. All the bad ideas are yours. I mean, learn that there needs to be freedom. Also, there needs to be freedom to try something. I would rather try something great for God and fail than do nothing. If your heart is right and you try something and it doesn't work, pick up the pieces, talk to your leaders, reconfigure it, and go try again. Not everything I've done in my life has succeeded. But there's been lots of lessons learned from where I haven't. Don't let favoritism or nepotism creep into your ministry. It'll destroy morale. Partnership. If they are part of your team, get away from them and take them with you to conferences, have a staff retreat, do things, build team. I played pro football, and so this is just a little bit of an example. What often happened in a pro football team is the guys would get together at practice, yes, but you know how a team got built? When we'd go together to a local hamburger spot after practice and talk to one another. Because the relationship building was as important as the practice. Okay? Fair compensation. Now, sometimes compensation is monetary. You're going to have a certain number of paid staff. I know a church where the paid staff, there was such phenomenal inequity that it literally destroyed the church because there was some nepotism. The people who were related to the pastor got paid more and did less than the people who were not related to the pastor. They did more and got less. And so there was this kind of division that the pastor was not treating people equitably and fairly. But yet in many large churches, most of the staff, the people who are doing the work, are non-paid volunteers. So when we had staff meetings, staff retreats, they'd all get invited. When we had recognition times in the church, we made sure they got more praise than even the paid staff. Because for paid staff, they do it because they're paid to do it. The others are doing it because they love the Lord and want to do it. That's a huge way to say thank you to people. Make sure that as people grow in their ministry, that you increase their authority and their responsibility. Be a leader of little, move to being a leader of much. Let people grow in their relationships. Number 6, be consistent. Your word is your word is your word. That's it. When you say you're going to do something as a leader, do it. Okay? I've learned that over the years. I've learned that if I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. If I say I'm going to be there, I'm going to be there. Tonight, my grandson graduates. I went to my grandson and said, congratulations. Gave him a big hug this afternoon and said, I'm sorry I can't be there tonight. Get some pictures taken of you. But I said, I made a commitment to Shield of Faith to be there to train leaders tonight. When I say yes, my yes is yes. When you say yes to your leaders, your yes has got to be yes. You cannot ever betray your leaders through broken promises. You need to be consistent. And you need to have friends. People say you don't hire people on your staff to be friends. I said, why not? I'd rather work with people I like than people I don't. I mean, friends are the best people to work with. Why? You get more done together. So the role and function of staff, you're multiple staff because you're larger, and the church role staffs from doing to supervising to training and deploying leaders. And the key issue for staff in helping the church move forward through 800 is you're able to mentor and develop leaders. I wish I could get this said in a way that helps you understand it. I love your staff here at this church. Yeah, Bishop, I've known Bishop for more than 10 years, maybe close to 20. Yeah, it's been a long time. I've taught, I don't know how many, but it's dozens of pastors' conferences for his pastors in the region. I know him real well. Because I know that, I know that this change that he's asking you to make is going to be tough for him. Because he loves his staff deeply. He affirms his staff. He said good things about all of his staff to me. You know, he's never spilt a bad word about any of his staff to me, even although I'm his confident and close friend. Never spoken a word bad of any of his staff to me. Never. But he knows he's going to have to work with you to make some changes. He's not doing it because he needs somebody else instead. He'd rather see you grow and develop into that position. So don't be afraid to grow and change yourself. You're going to ask your leaders to grow and change. Well, how can you ask them to do it if you won't? So here's the reality. Not all staff who bring a church to 400 can take a church through 800. As painful as it needs, I'm going to say something to you. Those of you who are staff and are being asked to make the changes, at some point, you may get to the point and say, the way the Bible teaches leaders of tens, leaders of 50s, leaders of hundreds, there is my role. It's not really the leader of large groups like this of 300 to 500. Talk to Bishop, because there are probably other churches in the movement that could use you because of your gift mix. But if you're not willing to change or can't change, or your gift mix doesn't allow you to function well in that, be honest. Be honest about who you are, because why? You're going to shrivel and die as a leader. You are. Okay? All right. We've got another few minutes. We'll start this issue. We may not finish it. This is called people flow. A church in the 500 to 800 range normally has attrition of between 10 and 12%. That is caused by people dying, moving out of the ministry area, going to another church, finding a church that better meets some of their needs, and sometimes people lose their love for the Lord and revert back to their non-church state. Numbers in this range are normal. So you're a church of 450. You're going to lose 45 to 50 people every year. Okay? That's normal. I'm not going to go and say, oh boy, your church is losing too many people. That's normal. You know, just moving across county lines in this LA County, 3.2% of people move across the county line every year. 1.2% of people move all the way out of state. You know, you're going to lose people. So, how can you grow a church? Because the first thing you got to do is replace the 50 you've lost and be plateaued. I mean, you got to take in 50 people just to remain plateaued. Now, plateaued churches normally only retain 10% of the people who visit the church and come back. Okay? If you're growing, you'll retain around 20%. Okay? Now let's be statistical for a moment. In non-growing churches, about 9% of the people who return That is first-time visitors who come back a second time. It's about 9%. In growing churches, it's about 21%. In second-time guests, that's people who come for the second time to the third, it grows to 17. It grows to 38 there. Then it grows to 36 in the non-growing, and it grows to 57. Now, watch this and pay attention. If you have a church of 450 people and you lose 50 people a year, how many visitors it take at 10% retention rate, that is people who stay, how many visitors it take to grow by 10%? Well, to start with, to get 50 at 10%, you're going to need 500 just to break even. You're going to need another 500 to grow by another 50 people. That's 1,000 people who visited the church over a year. Or to put that another way, in 52 Sundays, that's 20 visitors every Sunday. Now, the question is, how do you get 20 people a Sunday? You invite them. You could put tens of thousands into advertising, and you would never get that many visitors. I'm going to deal with this later on. I'm going to deal with the 5 elements of an effective DNA on my last session. I'm going to give you a little clue. Every large church has embedded in its DNA the oikos principle. Dr. Cho, who's a church of 1 million, every small group is trained in oikos evangelism to invite their neighbors and friends to come to their group and then come to the church. Tom Mercer, the largest church in the high desert, 70% of all of their church is first-time conversions invited by someone in the church, and they're growing at 20-25% a year. Unless the evangelistic consciousness seeps into the DNA of a large church, you've got a problem. And your problem is people flow. Because the normal attrition rates, like take a church of 100. 6 or 8 people leave. I mean, it's not hard for 6 or 8 people to come into a small church. I mean, that's easy. Get into a large church and now it's 1,000 people you need as visitors. All of a sudden, you really realize how many people it really takes. Now, the beauty of Pomona, this is so cool. Do you know in this large city we have, guess how many people actually attend any church, including the Catholic? What percentage is it? Anybody know? I do. I'm a missiologist. I'm paid to know that stuff. It's actually 17%. Believe it or not, 83% of Pomona is still available for you. So the people flow issues, visitor volume is one issue. I am. Now, I'm going to give you one concept and then we'll close and I'll pick up just summary of this because there's a prayer meeting at 7 o'clock and you guys are going over to Lincoln Avenue Church to pray for this city. And by the way, I was saying to Bishop, you know, we saw the report. I used to drive down to the 99-cent store and, you know, up to Staters, and you'd see, and all of you have seen this, just scores of prostitutes and drug addicts on the street. You know that in the last month they've taken 167 off the street? And you know, when I walk down, I'm more likely to see a group of people from a church walking down Holton praying than I am to see some hookers. Isn't that amazing? God's doing some great things. So the core, the congregation, and the crowd. You're the core. You're the leaders. The congregation are the 450 people who come on Sunday, maybe attend a small group. The crowd are the people in your oikos, the people who are the first and second time visitors, the people on the fringe. What ends up happening is churches with underaddressing this people issue have to find pathways to go from one step to another. So let's start at the simple level. How do you take the congregation that's sitting here every week? How do you take a percentage of them and develop them into a core of leaders? Expanding the leadership core. How do you take the people who are fringe, become part of a life group, become part of a Sunday school class, join the Bible college, do something to get them more faithful to God and grow in their relationship? So those issues need sharper definition. And so those are the pathways. All right. I'm going to stop there. That's a good spot to stop. It's about 7 minutes till. Let's take a couple of questions. Yes. The answer is I'm going to give you a simple answer and a more complex answer. Values, which are embedded into the life of a church and into the lives of people, are the core, because a value is what controls the behavior. My doctoral study was on the subject of values as a 14-page summation report. I'm going to give it to Bishop. He can pass it out to all of you. It deals with a lot of those things. Now, there is a prescription of how you shift the values. That's about an 87-page document. I'll give that to Bishop too. But there are things that you do. I hope I'm understanding this. If I don't feel like I love my wife, do you know the best way to do that? Is change my behavior and do something to love my wife. Stop and pick up some flowers. Give her a hug when I walk through the door. Change the behavior, you change the attitude. So what happens is, in order to build the value in, what we have to do is simple things that change the behavior. Okay? That's the simple way to do it. The other thing is, Tom Mercer does it this way. Every Sunday morning when he closes the message, he says, if you're not a part of the family of God, and what we've said today makes sense to you, I want you to know that becoming a Christian is as simple as ABC. Now, you may think that's very simple because he talks about admitting you're a sinner, believing that Jesus Christ is God's only solution, and committing your life to him. That may sound very trite, but if you do it every Sunday, guess what? Everybody in the church knows how to do it when somebody asks them about how to become a Christian. So he does that, and so he keeps that. So now, when people invite their friends to come to church with them, and they're now going out for lunch with their friends, and their friends talk about the church, and, well, how do you really become a Christian? You just take out a napkin and you say it's as simple as ABC. See, so you work at building it in. You work at doing things like having the kinds of special events where people feel very comfortable inviting their friends. You do it by having oikos type of training events. You do it in a variety of ways, and I can help Bishop with that. Other question? Yes? Let me address that. Part of what happens in the larger church is you don't allow ministries to get bigger. You allow ministries to get smaller. So, for example, if you're putting in 4 hours a week in your ministry, and you expand it by 10 or 15 people, Now all of a sudden you're not spending 4, you're spending 8 or 10, and you're reaching saturation. So what's going to end up happening is you're going to keep pushing it down and saying, if I could take what I did and train somebody to do what I did and had an apprentice leader that did it and cut my workload in half, it would make a lot of difference. See, one of the best ways to train lay leaders in a church is this. Take everybody who's doing something and have them select an apprentice. You'll double your workforce and cut the amount of hours that your leaders spend. You have to structure. I believe that most people will give you somewhere between 4 and 5 hours a week. If you want them to come to worship, you want them to participate in a small group, and you want them to do a ministry, and you want them to spend time with their oikos, or people who are unsaved, you better not get them in 6 and 8 hour a week volunteer jobs in the church. You better break that up so that they've got time. And one of the primary reasons, by the way, that people drop out of church is burnout. The only way they can go to another church is to get a break from the constant, we've got a phrase, if you want to get something done, find the busiest person, pile it onto them. We burn people out, then they move on to another church where they can sit and get their breath back. Oh. All right. Other question. Yeah. Well, you see, when you invite someone to church, your friendship has become the natural bridge to their incorporation into the body, because you can invite them to some other people, you can introduce them to some other people, and their network of friends in the church can begin to grow. Then they're going to want to come back week after week because they're starting to see these people that they know. So relationships is always the best way to assimilate, and it's always the best way to grow.
Any other completely critical question? Otherwise, we'll stop. Let's give God praise for Dr. Orr and tremendous, excellent. Come on, for real, y'all. Excellent teaching. Thank you, Dr. Robert.